Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where your neighbor might be your executioner, where standing in line becomes an art form, and where whispering the wrong joke could land you in Siberia. You're about to experience life as a Soviet citizen, and honestly, you probably won't survive this psychologically intact if you'd actually lived through it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this community span the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to the sound of your neighbor Mikhail's alarm bleeding through paper-thin walls at precisely 5:47 a.m. In your communal apartment, privacy is a Western luxury you've never known. 7 families share this space that was once a grand merchant's house before the revolution carved it up like a birthday cake nobody wanted. Your room is actually a corner of what used to be a ballroom, sectioned off with a hanging sheet that provides the illusion of privacy while offering none of its benefits. The morning light filters through windows that haven't been properly cleaned in months. Not because you're lazy, but because window cleaner disappeared from stores sometime last spring. You stretch in your narrow bed, feeling the springs protest under even your modest weight. This bed came with the apartment assignment, along with a desk that wobbles like a drunk sailor and a wardrobe that refuses to close properly. Across the thin partition, you hear the Petrovs arguing again about their teenage son's grades. Yesterday, little Dmitri brought home a report card that criticized his insufficient enthusiasm for collective agricultural theory. In the old world, parents might have laughed. Here they panic. Poor grades in political subjects can affect university admission, job assignments, even marriage prospects. Everything connects to everything in this system, like a spider web designed by a paranoid bureaucrat. You pad across cold linoleum floors toward the communal bathroom, hoping you're early enough to avoid the morning rush. The hallway smells of boiled cabbage and unwashed humanity, a scent cocktail that's become as familiar as your own heartbeat. 3 families are already queued outside the single bathroom door, holding their personal soap and towels like sacred relics. Mrs. Volkov nods at you with the kind of smile that doesn't reach her eyes. She's the building's unofficial informant, though everyone knows and nobody acknowledges it. Last month, the Sergeyevs on the 3rd floor vanished overnight after she reported their suspicious late-night gatherings. Those gatherings were actually just card games, but in a society where paranoia is currency, even gin rummy becomes treason. You shuffle toward the kitchen where the morning's real theatre begins. Historians still argue whether communal living was designed to foster socialist unity or simply to make surveillance easier. But standing here among 7 families competing for 4 burner plates, the distinction feels academic. The kitchen radiator clanks with a rhythm that sounds almost musical after 4 years of the same morning symphony. Your breakfast options depend entirely on what the state decided to distribute this week. If you're lucky, there might be black bread that's only slightly stale and tea that actually contains tea leaves rather than whatever plant matter they've been substituting lately. The butter disappeared Tuesday and nobody expects it back before the weekend, if then. The morning news crackles from someone's radio, announcing another record grain harvest that somehow never translates into more food in stores. Production statistics flow like poetry, each number more impressive and less believable than the last. Meanwhile, you mentally calculate whether you have enough rubles to attempt buying meat this week, knowing that even with money, availability remains a lottery you're likely to lose. Outside your grimy window, Moscow awakens with the mechanical precision of a city that runs on fear rather than dreams. Factory smokestacks pierce the grey sky like concrete fingers pointing toward a heaven that officially doesn't exist. You watch early commuters hurrying through streets where individual ambition has been replaced by collective mediocrity, where innovation is suspicious and conformity is survival. This is your morning routine in a world where the state owns everything, including you. You join the bread line at 6:23 a.m., already 15th in a queue that formed before dawn. The woman ahead of you clutches her string bag like it contains the crown jewels, though it holds only yesterday's newspaper and a thermos of weak tea. Her name is Elena, and over months of shared queuing, you've learned she's a factory supervisor who once dreamed of being a pianist before the state decided her fingers were better suited for inspecting radio components. The bread truck arrives 47 minutes late, which is actually early by Soviet standards. The driver, a man whose perpetual scowl suggests he's seen too many disappointed faces, begins unloading loaves with the enthusiasm of someone burying bodies. You count them instinctively, 32 loaves for at least 50 people. Mathematics becomes a cruel mistress in a shortage economy. Behind you, conversations flow in careful code. Mrs. Kozlov mentions her friend who found special items at a different location, which everyone understands means her black market contact scored Western cigarettes near the train station. Such discussions require the linguistic gymnastics of people who've learned that direct communication can be dangerous. Even grocery shopping becomes an exercise in espionage. When your turn finally arrives, you receive 1 1/4 loaves, a small victory that feels momentarily triumphant until you remember this represents your family's bread ration for 3 days. The bread itself is dense, dark and slightly sour, made from flour that's been stretched with sawdust and hope. Historians still argue whether Soviet bread shortages were due to distribution problems or deliberate population control. But standing here with your meagre allocation, such academic debates feel irrelevant. Your next stop is the meat counter, where hope goes to die. The display case contains exactly 4 items. A singles chicken that looks like it died of natural causes, 2 pieces of unidentifiable beef that might have once been a cow, and something labelled fish that bears no resemblance to any aquatic life you've ever seen. The prices are theoretically affordable, but the clerk's expression suggests these items are reserved for customers with better connections than yours. You approach anyway, because optimism is sometimes all that separates citizens from complete despair. "Excuse me, comrade, is that chicken available?" The clerk doesn't even look up from his newspaper. Yesterday's Pravda, which he's reading for the 3rd time because new entertainment is as scarce as fresh meat. "Reserved," he mutters, though you both know no reservation system exists. This is simply how power works in a world where access matters more than money. The vegetable section offers potatoes that have seen better decades and onions that make you weep even before you peel them. Cabbage sits in wilted piles looking like it's contemplating surrender. You select the least depressing specimens, knowing that by Western standards these vegetables would be considered agricultural failures, but here they represent dinner's foundation. A commotion erupts near the dairy counter as someone spots actual butter, the first seen in this district for 2 weeks. The queue reorganizes itself with the fluid precision of a military maneuver, elderly babushkas wielding their shopping bags like weapons as they jostle for position. You decide butter isn't worth potential injury and settle for the watery milk substitute that tastes like disappointment mixed with chalk. At the checkout, you hand over your ration book along with carefully counted rubles. The cashier examines each coupon with the intensity of a forensic scientist, ensuring you haven't somehow cheated the system out of an extra gram of sugar or milliliter of oil. Her scrutiny feels personal, though you understand it's simply how survival works when shortages make everyone potential thieves. Outside, you encounter your neighbour Victor, whose shopping bag contains items you haven't seen in months: real cheese, imported tea, and what appears to be actual chocolate. He notices your stare and quickly covers his bounty with a newspaper. You both understand this silent exchange. He has connections you lack, probably through his brother-in-law who works in the party food distribution centre. Such advantages aren't discussed openly, but they're obvious to anyone who pays attention to who eats well and who doesn't. The walk home becomes a meditation on inequality in a supposedly classless society. Your string bag contains survival, his contains abundance. The difference isn't money or merit. It's access to networks that operate parallel to official channels. This shadow economy determines who thrives and who merely endures in a system that claims to have eliminated such distinctions. You pass another bread line forming for the afternoon delivery, already longer than this morning's queue. Word spreads faster than facts in a shortage economy, and rumors of food deliveries draw crowds like urban prophets attracting disciples. You arrive at factory number 47 precisely at 7:30 a.m., badge number 2847 pinned to your grey work coat like a prison identification tag. The morning siren wails across the industrial complex, calling workers to their designated positions in what theoretically represents the triumph of the proletariat, but practically feels more like well-organized tedium. Your workstation awaits, a corner of the vast assembly floor where you'll spend the next 8 hours pretending productivity while the state pretends to compensate you fairly. The factory produces radio components for the glorious Soviet electronics industry, though everyone knows these radios will barely function and certainly won't compete with Western models that somehow find their way into party officials' homes. Your specific job involves installing capacitors into circuit boards, a task that requires approximately 15 minutes of genuine effort stretched across an entire workday through the miracle of socialist labor practices. Alexei, your workstation neighbor, greets you with the standard morning ritual, a complaint about his back pain that serves as coded commentary on the futility of your shared existence. "My spine feels like it's grinding wheat," he mutters, which everyone understands means he's hungover from last night's vodka session, the only reliable escape from daily reality. You respond appropriately. "Perhaps you need better rest, comrade," which translates to, "I understand your pain, but we can't discuss it openly because someone's always listening." The morning production meeting begins with Supervisor Petrov reading statistics that would make mathematicians weep. According to official reports, your factory exceeded its quota by 47% last month, while simultaneously reducing material waste by 23%. These numbers exist in a parallel universe where Soviet factories operate efficiently rather than barely fjapdam. Nectioning through creative bookkeeping and statistical creativity. Everyone applauds because applauding is expected, not because anyone believes what they're hearing. Your actual work begins around 9:15 a.m. after extended discussions about technique improvements that will never be implemented and safety protocols that everyone ignores. The assembly line moves with the speed of bureaucratic progress, slow enough to prevent actual productivity, but fast enough to maintain the illusion of industrial progress. You install your first capacitor of the day with the same enthusiasm you'd reserve for dental surgery. By 10:30 a.m., you've completed roughly 1 hour's worth of actual work and begun the day's real activity, creative time killing. Some workers develop elaborate personal projects using factory materials. Dmitry in Section C has been secretly building a chess set for 3 months, using metal scraps and unauthorized break time. Others perfect the art of strategic bathroom breaks that can extend into mini vacations from the assembly line. The lunch break arrives like salvation, though the cafeteria offers food that makes your morning's grocery store selections seem gourmet by comparison. Today's special is something called meat stew, that contains neither identifiable meat nor recognizable vegetables, served alongside bread that could double as construction material. You eat anyway, because hunger makes philosophers of us all, and even bad food becomes acceptable when it's free, and you're genuinely hungry. Afternoon production quotas require creative interpretation that would impress fiction writers. when the official count demands 847 completed units, but your section only produces 623. The difference gets reconciled through paperwork magic that transforms incomplete assemblies into finished products. Historians still argue whether Soviet industrial statistics reflected incompetence or deliberate deception. But standing on this factory floor, such distinctions become meaningless when you're participating in the daily fiction. Your supervisor demonstrates the peculiar skill of looking busy while accomplishing nothing, a talent perfected across generations of Soviet management. He carries clipboards with great authority, examines completed work with intense concentration, and holds meetings about scheduling future meetings. His job security depends not on actual productivity, but on his ability to generate reports that make higher authorities feel satisfied with factory performance. The afternoon stretches like philosophical contemplation, each minute crawling past with the enthusiasm of a condemned prisoner approaching execution. You develop elaborate mental games, counting ceiling tiles, calculating how many capacitors you'd need to build an actual functioning radio, imagining what jobs might exist in countries where work serves purposes beyond social control. Around 4 p.m., productivity reaches its dales. A peak as workers realize the end approaches. Suddenly, everyone becomes briefly competent, completing tasks that should have taken all day in mere minutes. This burst of actual efficiency serves as daily proof that Soviet workers possess skills their system consistently fails to utilize effectively. The closing siren finally releases you from this theater of simulated labor, and you file out with hundreds of other actors who've just completed another performance in the ongoing drama titled Socialist Industrial Success. You return to your communal apartment with the day's factory dust still clinging to your clothes and the careful paranoia that has become your second skin. In the hallway you pass young Pavel from the second floor, who nods with the kind of rigid politeness that suggests he's been having conversations with people who ask too many questions about his neighbors. His eyes don't quite meet yours anymore, a telling sign in a world where eye contact has become a form of political statement. The kitchen buzzes with its usual evening activity, but tonight the conversations die a little too quickly when you enter. Mrs. Volkov stirs her soup with excessive concentration while the Petrov family suddenly becomes fascinated by their day-old newspaper. You recognize this atmospheric shift. Someone has been asking questions, and everyone's wondering who might have provided answers. In Soviet society, information flows upward through invisible channels that connect every apartment building to vast networks of surveillance. You begin preparing your modest dinner while listening to the careful choreography of communal conversation. Topics get approached obliquely, like cats stalking nervous prey. When Mrs. Sergeeva mentions her son's upcoming university application, she doesn't say he's worried about the political reliability questions. Instead, she talks about his concern for proper documentation, which everyone understands as code for fear that someone's reported the family for insufficient enthusiasm about collective farming policies. The radio in the corner plays the evening news, announcing another successful harvest in Ukraine, while everyone pretends not to notice that bread remains scarce and vegetables look increasingly desperate. These broadcasts serve a dual purpose. They provide official reality for those who need to demonstrate proper political awareness, while simultaneous. Sly reminding everyone that truth is whatever the state decides it should be. You've learned to listen for what isn't said. The gaps between official announcements often contain more useful information than the words themselves. After dinner, you retreat to your sectioned corner with a book that's been carefully chosen for its political neutrality. Reading has become a minefield where even classic Russian literature can be interpreted as seditious if examined through the wrong ideological lens. Tonight's selection is a technical manual about radio repair, boring enough to be safe, useful enough to justify owning. Historians still argue whether Soviet citizens became naturally paranoid or simply developed appropriate survival responses to genuine threats. But sitting here calculating the political implications of your entertainment choices, such academic distinctions feel irrelevant. Through your thin partition, you hear the Kozlovs arguing in whispers about their daughter's teacher, who apparently asked the class to write essays about their parents' evening conversations. Little Anya innocently mentioned that her father sometimes listens to foreign radio broadcasts, a confession that could destroy the family's future prospects and possibly land her father in prison. Such are the everyday tragedies of a system where children become unwitting informants against their own parents. The apartment's shared telephone rings precisely at 8:47 p.m. and everyone freezes. Phone calls after 8 p.m. usually bring bad news, summons to appear at government offices, notifications about job reassignments to distant cities, or worse. Tonight it's for the Mikhailovs, whose son was supposed to return from military service last month but has been detained for additional political education. The mother's muffled sobs penetrate every wall in the building, creating a soundtrack of fear that nobody acknowledges but everyone understands. You attempt to write a letter to your cousin in Leningrad, but the words require careful consideration. Letters get opened and read by postal authorities who look for signs of political dissent, economic complaints, or unauthorized information sharing. What should be simple family communication becomes an exercise in creative writing where you must convey genuine thoughts through coded language that won't trigger official interest. You write about hoping the weather improves soon, which your cousin will understand as commentary on political conditions rather than meteorological concerns. Outside your window, you occasionally glimpse figures moving through the courtyard with the deliberate casualness of people conducting surveillance. These might be legitimate residents going about evening business, or they might be observers monitoring who sits whom and when. In Soviet society, such distinctions matter less than the assumption that someone's always watching. This constant possibility of observation shapes behavior in ways both subtle and profound. You wave cheerfully at windows that might contain watchers, not because you're friendly, but because appearing normal requires performing normalcy. Before sleep, you mentally review the day's conversations, analysing each exchange for statements that might be misinterpreted or remarks that could be reported. This nightly ritual of paranoid reflection has become as routine as brushing teeth, a mental hygiene practice designed to prevent the kind of careless words that can destroy lives in systems where political orthodoxy determines survival. You wake at 5:15 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Someone's already queuing for something, which means you're already behind in the daily competition for basic necessities. Shopping in the Soviet Union isn't a casual consumer activity. It's a strategic military operation that requires intelligence gathering, tactical planning, and the physical endurance of a marathon runner combined with the patience of a monk. Today's mission: attempting to acquire soap, which disappeared from local stores 3 weeks ago like morning mist. Your first stop is store number 14, where the queue already stretches around the building despite the fact that the store won't open for another 2 hours. The early birds clutch numbered scraps of paper from an informal queuing system that operates outside official recognition, a shadow economy of waiting that determines who gets served and who goes home empty-handed. Mrs. Fedorova, who's been standing here since 4 a.m., generously explains that today's rumoured delivery includes not just soap, but possibly shampoo and maybe even Western toothpaste that fell off a truck somewhere between Moscow and reality. The queue psychology fasculates sociologists, if any existed, who dared study it objectively. People arrange themselves not just by arrival time, but by complex social hierarchies involving age, gender, party connections, and mysterious personal relationships that can advance someone's position through unspoken negotiations. You watch an elderly veteran move forward 3 positions through whispered conversations about shared military service, while a young mother with crying twins somehow gains priority through the universal sympathy that transcends political systems. By 7:30 a.m., the queue has developed its own microeconomy where information becomes currency more valuable than rubles. Someone heard the truck driver mention toilet paper in a Detian to soap. Another person claims their cousin who works in distribution said this shipment came from East Germany, which means quality that approaches Western standards. These rumors spread like religious revelations among people who've learned to survive on hope and strategic eavesdropping. The store opens at 8 a.m. sharp, but the actual shopping process moves with the speed of geological formation. Each customer receives individual attention from clerks who examine every purchase with forensic intensity, cross-referencing ration books, checking identification documents, and manually recording transactions in ledgers that would make medieval monks feel nostalgic. You watch 17 people ahead of you purchase soap, with the ceremony typically reserved for precious metals transactions. When your turn finally arrives, you discover the cruel mathematics of shortage economics. The store has 34 bars of soap for a queue of over 100 people. Your position, 38th in line, places you in that heartbreaking category of almost but not quite. The clerk, whose expression suggests she's performed this disappointing routine daily for years, shrugs with the philosophical resignation of someone who's learned that explaining scarcity doesn't make it less frustrating. Your backup plan involves store number 23 across the district, where rumors suggest a different delivery might include cleaning supplies. The journey requires 3 bus transfers and 47 minutes of travel time, but such calculations represent normal shopping logistics in a system where goods appear randomly across the city like beneficial accidents. The bus ride provides opportunities to gather intelligence from other shoppers whose conversations reveal the current state of citywide inventory. Bread appeared unexpectedly in the eastern districts, but meat remains mythical except for those with connections to restaurant suppliers. Store number 23's queue is shorter but more sophisticated, populated by professional shoppers who've developed queuing into an art form. These are mostly retired babushkas whose daily missions involve complex multi-store expeditions designed to maximize acquisition possibilities across various product categories. They carry multiple bags, maintain detailed mental maps of delivery schedules, and share information through networks that would impress intelligence agencies. You join their queue with the humility of an amateur among masters. 3 hours later, you emerge victorious with 1 bar of soap that costs nearly as much as your daily wages, but represents a genuine triumph in the ongoing battle against dirt and despair. This soap will be rationed caref. Uli, used only for essential washing, while you pray that more appears before this bar disappears. Such victories feel disproportionately satisfying in a world where acquiring basic necessities requires the strategic planning typically reserved for military campaigns. Historians still argue whether Soviet shortages resulted from production failures or distribution incompetence. But standing in your apartment holding today's hard-won soap, such academic debates feel irrelevant compared to the simple satisfaction of knowing you'll be clean tomorrow. You settle into your evening routine with the television flickering to life at precisely 7 p.m., broadcasting the only channel available in your district, a technological limitation that the state presents as evidence of focused programming rather than restricted choice. Tonight's lineup promises the usual blend of agricultural reports, industrial achievements, and international news carefully filtered through ideological lenses that transform global events into propaganda supporting Soviet superiority. The newscaster, whose unchanging expression suggests he's been practicing emotional neutrality for decades, begins with statistics about tractor production that would make accountants weep. The television itself represents a minor miracle of Soviet engineering, meaning it occasionally works and sometimes displays images that vaguely resemble what they're supposed to show. The screen flickers with the consistency of a nervous twitch, and the sound periodically disappears into electronic silence that forces viewers to read lips or imagine dialogue. Such technical limitations become acceptable when they represent your only window into officially sanctioned entertainment, though everyone knows the real shows happen on channels you're not supposed to receive. Between the agricultural statistics and factory production reports, you carefully adjust the television's antenna, a delicate operation that requires the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. Too far left, and the picture dissolves into snow. Too far right, and mysterious voices speaking unfamiliar languages occasionally bleed through from broadcasts originating beyond the Iron Curtain. These accidental receptions provide tantalizing glimpses of Western programming that officially doesn't exist, but somehow manages to penetrate even Soviet airwaves through the miracle of radio wave physics. During commercial BR, EECs, which consist entirely of public service announcements about proper socialist behavior, you engage in the evening's real entertainment, carefully tuning your small radio to frequencies that might, if atmospheric conditions cooperate and surveillance equipment malfunctions simultaneously, pick up broadcasts from BBC World Service or Voice of America. This requires headphones, closed doors, and the kind of paranoid attention to your surroundings that has become second nature after years of living under systems where curiosity about the outside world qualifies as suspicious behavior. The contrast between official television programming and foreign radio broadcasts creates a cognitive dissonance that would challenge philosophy professors. Soviet news reports describe Western societies collapsing under capitalist oppression, while foreign broadcasts discuss technological advances, cultural achievements, and living standards that sound like science fiction compared to your daily reality. Navigating these competing narratives requires the mental agility of someone constantly translating between different versions of truth. Your neighbor Mikhail taps 3 times on the thin wall, your agreed-upon signal meaning he's successfully located an interesting foreign frequency. Through whispered coordination, you synchronize your radios to receive what appears to be a British music program featuring artists whose names you don't recognize, but whose music sounds impossibly sophisticated compared to the folk songs and military marches that dominate Soviet programming. For 23 minutes, you exist in a parallel universe where entertainment serves pleasure rather than political education. The television programming resumes with a documentary about collective farming successes that bears no resemblance to the food shortages you experience daily. Smiling farmers describe abundant harvests while you mentally calculate whether your remaining bread will last until tomorrow's hopeful shopping expedition. Such documentaries require viewers to develop sophisticated skills in cognitive compartmentalization. The ability to absorb official information without allowing it to interfere with practical knowledge gained through lived experience. Between propaganda segments, you practice the delicate art of appearing engaged with state television while actually listening to foreign radio through a single earphone hidden beneath strategically arranged hair. This requires synchronized facial expressions that suggest appropriate responses to socialist programming while your brain processes entirely different information about Western economic policies or international sporting events that Soviet media ignores unless they provide opportunities for political commentary. The evening news concludes with international reports that present global events through ideological filters so thick they obscure actual information. Western technological advances become evidence of capitalist desperation, while Soviet achievements in space exploration receive coverage that would make religious broadcasters seem understated. Historians still argue whether Soviet media producers believed their own propaganda or simply performed assigned roles, but watching these broadcasts, such distinctions matter less than the daily challenge of extracting useful information from carefully constructed narratives. As programming shifts toward cultural content, tonight features a ballet performance celebrating agricultural workers. You carefully return your radio to officially sanctioned frequencies and prepare for another evening of entertainment designed to educate rather than amuse, knowing that tomorrow will bring another opportunity to glimpse the world beyond your borders. You wake with a persistent cough that's been building for weeks, joining the morning queue at the neighborhood clinic where free healthcare represents one of socialism's genuine achievements, assuming you don't mind waiting 3 hours to see a doctor who has 12 minutes to diagnose whatever's wrong with you. The waiting room contains 47 people ahead of you, each clutching the small paper numbers that determine medical destiny in a system where demand consistently overwhelms supply, despite the theoretical abundance of socialist medicine. The clinic itself occupies a building that probably seemed modern during Stalin's era, but now resembles a monument to deferred maintenance. Fluorescent lights flicker with epileptic intensity above linoleum floors that have lost their original color beneath decades of foot traffic and inadequate cleaning supplies. The walls display posters promoting public health through proper socialist living, though the irony of encouraging wellness in a facility that looks chronically ill escapes no one who possesses functioning eyeballs. Your fellow patients represent a cross-section of Soviet medical needs. Elderly workers whose bodies have surrendered to decades of industrial labor, mothers with children whose fevers resist home remedies, and middle-aged men whose drinking habits have progressed beyond vodka's ability to solve life's fundamental problems. Everyone waits with the patient resignation of people who understand that complaining won't accelerate service and might actually result in worse treatment from medical staff who've learned to interpret criticism as personal attacks on socialist medicine. When your number finally gets called, you enter an examination room that contains equipment that would fascinate medical historians if they specialized in studying outdated technology. The stethoscope appears to be a genuine antique. The blood pressure cuff requires manual pumping that provides upper body exercise for medical personnel, and the examination table creaks with the authority of furniture that's witnessed more medical procedures than most doctors perform in entire careers. Dr. Petrov examines you with the efficiency of someone who's learned to diagnose common problems through pattern recognition rather than extensive testing. Your persistent cough receives a 30-second evaluation that concludes with a prescription for antibiotics that may or may not be available at the pharmacy, depending on delivery schedules that operate according to principles known only to pharmaceutical distribution bureaucrats. He explains that X-rays require a 3-week waiting period unless you're experiencing life-threatening symptoms, which apparently don't include coughing up blood, only significant blood, which remains undefined. The prescription itself becomes a minor adventure in pharmaceutical economics. The clinic pharmacy contains approximately 12 medications, none of which match your prescribed antibiotics. The pharmacist, whose expression suggests she's explained this situation countless times daily for years, offers a substitute medication that works similarly, but requires taking 4 pills every 6 hours instead of 2 pills twice daily. Such pharmaceutical flexibility requires patients to become their own medical researchers, calculating dosages and hoping that chemical similarities translate into therapeutic effectiveness. Your backup plan involves visiting 3 additional pharmacies across the district, each specializing in different categories of unavailable medications. Pharmacy number 7 occasionally stocks antibiotics but currently offers only vitamins and aspirin. Pharmacy number 12 has antibiotics, but requires a different prescription format that necessitates returning to the clinic for paperwork modifications. This medical scavenger hunt represents normal healthcare logistics in a system where treating simple infections requires the organizational skills typically associated with military campaigns. Meanwhile, your cough worsens with the persistence of someone who's learned that Soviet medicine works best for patients who don't actually need medical attention. The irony isn't lost on you that a system promising comprehensive healthcare often delivers comprehensive frustration instead, though you recognize that free, inadequate medicine still beats expensive, inadequate medicine available in other economic systems. After 4 hours of medical tourism across your district, you finally acquire antibiotics from a pharmacy whose stock appeared mysteriously overnight, probably diverted from supplies intended for a different district where someone with better connections decided they needed medicine more than you did. Such pharmaceutical redistribution operates through informal networks that determine who gets treated and who continues coughing while waiting for the next delivery. Historians still argue whether Soviet healthcare failures resulted from underfunding or systemic inefficiencies. But sitting in your apartment with antibiotics that may or may not cure your cough, such academic debates feel less important than the simple hope that tomorrow you'll breathe a little easier. You walk your 8-year-old daughter Katya to school number 41, where she'll spend the morning learning mathematics through word problems about collective farm productivity and practice reading using stories about heroic Soviet workers who sacrifice personal happiness for societal advancement. The school building stands as a monument to utilitarian architecture, functional, grey, and designed to inspire discipline rather than wonder. Children file through its doors like small soldiers reporting for ideological duty, their uniforms identical and their expressions already learning the careful neutrality required for survival in systems where wrong answers can have consequences extending far beyond failed examinations. Katya's teacher, Mrs. Volokova, greets each student with the kind of forced enthusiasm that suggests she's spent summers at political education camps learning to present communist ideology as exciting entertainment for young minds. Today's lesson plan includes arithmetic problems, calculating steel production increases, geography focusing exclusively on Soviet achievements, and literature featuring stories about children who report their parents' suspicious activities to appropriate authorities. Educational content that would make child psychologists weep, if any existed, who dared analyze the psychological impact of turning family loyalty into potential treason. The classroom itself reflects educational priorities where political indoctrination takes precedence over critical thinking development. Maps display the Soviet Union in prominent red, while other countries appear in subdued colors suggesting their inferior status. Posters celebrate industrial workers, agricultural heroes and military victories while conspicuously avoiding any images suggesting that individual creativity or personal ambition might be valuable social contributions. Even the alphabet cards feature words like assembly and brigade instead of more traditional educational vocabulary. During recess, you observe children playing games that mirror adult society's careful paranoia. They form small groups that share secrets in whispers, practice the art of looking busy while accomplishing nothing, and engage in complex social hierarchies based on whose parents possess better political connections rather than traditional playground metrics like athletic ability or personal popularity. Such childhood dynamics represent preparation for adult life, where social navigation requires understanding invisible power structures that determine individual fate more than merit or effort. The school lunch program provides meals that technically fulfill nutritional requirements while demonstrating the practical limitations of centralized food distribution. Today's menu features something called meat stew that contains ingredients of mysterious origin, bread that could double as construction material, and vegetables that surrendered their will to live weeks before arriving at the cafeteria. Children eat because hunger makes philosophers of everyone, including 8-year-olds who've learned to find nourishment in food that would make restaurant critics consider career changes. Afternoon classes focus on history lessons that present Soviet achievements as inevitable results of superior economic systems, while describing Western societies as declining capitalist experiments doomed to failure through their own internal contradictions. Students learn dates, names, and political interpretations without developing analytical skills that might enable them to question official narratives or compare different historical perspectives. Such educational approaches create citizens who can recite approved information without developing the critical thinking abilities that might lead to uncomfortable questions about system effectiveness. During art class, children create paintings celebrating industrial themes, agricultural abundance, and political leaders whose portraits must be rendered with appropriate reverence and anatomical accuracy. Creative expression gets channeled towards socially approved subjects that reinforce official values rather than encouraging individual imagination or personal artistic exploration. The most talented young artists learn to paint tractors and factory smokestacks with the same enthusiasm that children in other societies might reserve for drawing dragons or fairy tales. Your daughter returns home with homework assignments that require family participation, writing essays about parents' work contributions to socialist society, interviewing grandparents about improvements in living conditions since the revolution, and preparing presentations about regional industrial achievements. Such assignments serve dual purposes. They reinforce classroom political education while providing subtle opportunities for teachers to gather information about family attitudes, opinions, and potentially problematic beliefs that might require additional attention from school authorities. The most challenging aspect of Soviet childhood education isn't academic difficulty, but the constant requirement to navigate between home truths and school requirements. Children learn early to compartmentalize information, presenting appropriate responses to official questions while privately understanding that reality often contradicts approved narratives. This psychological skill development prepares them for adult life in systems where survival depends on managing multiple versions of truth simultaneously. Historians still argue whether Soviet educational systems genuinely believed in their ideological content or simply functioned as social control mechanisms. But watching your daughter practice appropriate responses to political questions, such academic debates feel less relevant than helping her develop the emotional resilience necessary for succeeding in educational environments where conformity matters more than curiosity. You meet Anna at the park near the textile factory where she works as a seamstress, your romance unfolding under the watchful eyes of a society where even love requires careful navigation through political implications that can determine whether relationships flourish or result in administrative consequences that affect employment, housing assignments, and future opportunities. In the Soviet Union, falling in love isn't just a personal experience. It's a political act that gets evaluated by authorities who monitor citizen behavior through lenses that transform private affection into potential security concerns. Your courtship follows patterns established by generations of Soviet couples who've learned to express intimacy through coded conversations that avoid topics capable of triggering official interest. Walking through the park, you discuss safe subjects like weather patterns and factory production schedules, while your eyes communicate deeper feelings that can't be verbalized in spaces where park benches might conceal listening devices and fellow strollers could be reporting romantic conversations to authorities who catalog personal relationships as potential intelligence sources. Anna works in a factory where her supervisor maintains detailed records about worker personal lives, documenting who dates whom, whose relationships appear politically reliable, and which romantic attachments might represent security risks requiring additional monitoring. Such workplace surveillance affects how she discusses your relationship with colleagues, forcing her to present your growing attachment as casual friendship rather than acknowledging the deeper emotional connection that could prompt her supervisor to investigate your background, employment history, and political reliability. Your letters to Anna require the same careful composition used for family correspondence: romantic, expressions filtered through language that won't trigger postal censorship while still conveying genuine affection through coded phrases that speak to hearts without alarming authorities who read private mail searching for evidence of inappropriate political opinions or unauthorized information sharing. Writing, "I hope the weather in your district improves soon," becomes a way of saying, "I miss you," without using words that might suggest excessive emotional attachment to individuals rather than collective social goals. The challenge of Soviet romance involves finding private spaces for intimate conversations in a society where privacy is viewed with suspicion, and couples who spend too much time alone together might be accused of engaging in activities that undermine collective solidarity. Your meetings occur in public spaces where you can demonstrate appropriate social behavior while exchanging glances that communicate feelings impossible to express verbally, without risking the kind of attention that transforms personal relationships into administrative problems. Anna's apartment situation complicates romantic development since she shares living space with 3 other families whose members possess detailed knowledge about her personal life, whether she volunteers such information or not. Bringing a romantic partner home for dinner requires navigation through complex social protocols involving multiple family units who will evaluate your political reliability, economic prospects, and potential impact on their own security within the communal living arrangement that makes privacy impossible and discretion essential. Your employment backgrounds receive careful scrutiny from both families as potential marriage partners undergo informal background investigations conducted by relatives who understand that romantic choices affect entire family networks in systems where individual actions have collective consequences. Anna's uncle, who works in factory administration, discreetly inquires about your work performance, political attitudes, and social connections that might enhance or compromise family standing within community hierarchies that determine access to better housing, employment opportunities, and consumer goods. The progression from courtship to serious relationship requires careful timing that takes into account bureaucratic schedules that control housing assignments, job transfers, and marriage permissions that affect where couples can live and work together. Such administrative considerations transform romantic planning into exercises in governmental logistics where wedding dates depend more on bureaucratic approval than emotional readiness, and honeymoon destinations get determined by travel authorization rather than personal preference. Physical intimacy develops within constraints imposed by living situations where privacy remains elusive, and romantic expression must accommodate communal arrangements that make personal relationships subject to community oversight. Finding moments alone together requires strategic planning that would impress military tacticians, involving careful coordination of work schedules, family obligations, and social commitments that create brief opportunities for genuine personal connection. Historians still argue whether Soviet social controls intentionally targeted romantic relationships or simply affected them as collateral consequences of broader surveillance systems. But sitting in this park, holding Anna's hand while monitoring our surroundings for potential observers, such academic distinctions feel less relevant than the immediate challenge of building lasting love within systems designed to prioritize collective loyalty over individual attachment. You arrive at the mandatory Saturday afternoon volunteer work session at the community centre, where citizens demonstrate socialist enthusiasm by participating in activities that theoretically represent collective recreation but practically serve as opportunities for political education disguised as entertainment. The community centre itself occupies a converted warehouse whose interior decorators apparently specialised in inspiring revolutionary fervour through strategic placement of red banners, industrial lighting, and furniture that prioritises ideological correctness over human comfort. Today's scheduled activities include a lecture about agricultural achievements in the Kazakh region, followed by groups singing of songs celebrating industrial workers, and concluding with a discussion session where community members share thoughts about improving local socialist development, though everyone understands that sharing actual thoughts rather than approved opinions could result in the kind of attention that makes future Saturday sessions feel less voluntary and more like mandatory attendance at political rehabilitation programs. The lecture begins with Comrade Fedorov, whose enthusiasm for discussing grain production statistics suggests he's either genuinely passionate about agricultural policy or exceptionally skilled at performing political enthusiasm for audiences that include potential informants. His presentation features charts documenting harvest increases that bear no relationship to the food shortages everyone experiences daily, creating the kind of cognitive dissonance that requires audiences to applaud statistical achievements while mentally calculating whether they have enough bread for Sunday's breakfast. During the singing portion, you join voices raised in harmony, celebrating the dignity of factory labour, the glory of collective farming, and the wisdom of source. Political leadership that guides Soviet society toward inevitable triumph over capitalist oppression. The songs themselves possess a certain melodic appeal, though their lyrics transform recreational music into ideological programming designed to reinforce approved attitudes through repetitive exposure to political messaging set to memorable tunes that stick in minds long after the community centre sessions end. The group discussion segment represents the afternoon's most dangerous activity as community members navigate between appearing engaged with socialist development while avoiding statements that might be interpreted as criticism of existing conditions or unauthorized suggestions for improvements that could imply current systems operate imperfectly. Participants master the art of speaking extensively while saying nothing substantive, offering observations that sound thoughtful without containing actual thoughts that could trigger administrative interest. Mrs. Petrov suggests that community gardens might benefit from enhanced coordination with existing agricultural planning initiatives, which everyone understands as a carefully coded way of saying the local food distribution system fails consistently without directly criticizing governmental competence. Her phrasing demonstrates the linguistic gymnastics required for public discourse in societies where honest communication about practical problems could be construed as political dissent requiring corrective attention from appropriate authorities. Between official activities, you engage in the session's real social function, informal information exchange that operates beneath the surface of approved community interaction. Through whispered conversations disguised as discussions about weather patterns, community members share intelligence about food deliveries, employment opportunities, and housing availability that determines daily survival strategies more effectively than official announcements that consistently promise improvements that never materialize according to predicted schedules. Young Pavel mentions that his cousin heard rumors about soap deliveries next week, while elderly Mrs. Volkova quietly indicates that her friend who works in textile distribution expects fabric supplies that could enable clothing repairs for families whose garments have reached the point where continued wearing requires creative approaches to maintaining dignity while dealing with wardrobe items that would have been discarded years ago in societies with functioning consumer economies. The afternoon's entertainment concludes with a film screening featuring a documentary about Soviet space achievements that presents technological triumphs with appropriate pride while carefully avoiding any comparisons with Western space programs that might suggest international competition rather than inevitable socialist progress towards scientific goals that demonstrate systemic superiority. The film quality reflects production values that prioritize political messaging over cinematographic excellence, though everyone watches with appropriate attention because failing to appear interested in Soviet achievements could be noted by observers who attend these sessions for reasons beyond recreational enjoyment. As the session ends, you file out with fellow community members who've spent another Saturday demonstrating collective enthusiasm while privately calculating how much of your weekend has been consumed by mandatory recreation that serves political functions rather than providing genuine leisure opportunities. Such calculations represent the ongoing challenge of maintaining personal time within systems where individual preferences must accommodate collective activities designed to reinforce social cohesion through organized participation rather than spontaneous community development. Historians still argue whether Soviet recreational programming genuinely aimed to improve citizen welfare or primarily functioned as social control mechanisms that monitored community attitudes while providing forums for political education. But walking home from another Saturday session, such academic debates feel less relevant than the simple desire for weekends that serve relaxation rather than ideological reinforcement. You discover that Victor from the fourth floor has acquired genuine American cigarettes, Marlboros in their distinctive red and white packaging that might as well be bars of gold given their rarity and value in the Soviet underground economy, where Western consumer goods represent not just luxury items but symbols of a lifestyle that officially doesn't exist, yet somehow manages to infiltrate even the most carefully controlled socialist societies. These cigarettes didn't arrive through legal channels that don't exist anyway, but through the shadow networks that operate parallel to official distribution systems and determine who accesses forbidden luxuries. The transaction requires more discretion than international espionage operations, involving coded conversations about meeting to discuss mutual friends and rendezvous locations chosen for their isolation from surveillance equipment that may or may not exist, but certainly influences behavior of citizens who've learned to assume they're always being observed. Victor's apartment building maintenance closet becomes today's trading post where capitalism functions efficiently despite existing within a system theoretically designed to eliminate such economic relationships through collective ownership of everything, including cigarette distribution rights. Your negotiation currency consists of items equally difficult to obtain through official channels. A bottle of Hungarian wine that somehow appeared at your workplace, 2 bars of Finnish soap acquired during last month's shopping expedition, and information about a furniture delivery scheduled for next Thursday at store number 23. In the Soviet Union, information often possesses greater value than money, since knowing when and where goods will appear determines who succeeds in acquiring necessities that randomly materialize across the city, like beneficial accidents that reward those with superior intelligence networks. Victor's pricing reflects complex calculations involving risk assessment, rarity evaluation, and market demand among customers whose purchasing power gets measured in access to scarce commodities rather than accumulated rubles that can't buy products that don't officially exist in stores that don't stock Western merchandise. 1 pack of Marlboros costs the equivalent of 3 days' wages plus the soap and wine, though such calculations ignore the transaction's real cost. Participating in economic activities that could result in criminal charges if discovered by authorities who monitor citizen behavior for evidence of capitalist tendencies. The cigarettes themselves represent more than tobacco products. They're symbols of Western lifestyle that suggest individual choice, consumer variety, and manufacturing quality that exceeds Soviet industrial standards by margins that would embarrass central planning committees if such comparisons were permitted in official discourse. Smoking a Marlboro becomes an act of temporary rebellion against systems that control not just what you consume, but what consumption options exist within approved economic frameworks that prioritize collective needs over individual preferences. Your smoking experience takes place in carefully chosen locations where Western cigarette consumption won't attract attention from neighbors who might report such displays of capitalist preference to building supervisors who maintain detailed records about resident behavior that could affect future housing assignments, employment opportunities, or family members' educational prospects. Such precautions transform simple tobacco enjoyment into covert operations requiring surveillance, awareness, and strategic planning that would impress intelligence operatives. The cigarette's superior quality becomes immediately apparent through comparison with Soviet tobacco products that seem designed to discourage smoking through their harsh taste and irregular burning characteristics. Western manufacturing standards create consumer experiences that Soviet industrial planning apparently can't replicate, despite official claims about achieving production excellence that surpasses capitalist quality standards. Such direct comparisons provide empirical evidence about systemic differences that official propaganda works diligently to obscure through statistical presentations that avoid discussing actual product quality. Sharing these cigarettes with trusted friends requires careful evaluation of political reliability and discretion capabilities, since enjoying forbidden luxuries together creates mutual vulnerability that could be exploited by authorities who encourage citizens to report each other's suspicious activities through reward systems that transform community solidarity into competitive surveillance networks. Friendship itself becomes complicated when maintaining relationships requires constant assessment of whether personal connections represent genuine affection or potential security risks. The empty cigarette package presents disposal challenges since Western packaging materials serve as evidence of participation in underground economic activities that violate official policies prohibiting unauthorized commerce in foreign goods. Such evidence must be destroyed completely rather than simply discarded in building trash containers, where it might be discovered by maintenance workers who supplement their incomes by reporting residents' suspicious possessions to authorities who pay modest bonuses for information about citizen behavior that deviates from approved patterns. Historians still argue whether Soviet black market activities represented systemic failures in central planning or natural human responses to artificial scarcity created by ideological opposition to consumer choice. But standing here disposing of Marlboro packaging while savouring memories of superior tobacco quality, such academic debates feel less relevant than the immediate satisfaction of experiencing briefly what life might offer in societies where cigarette selection represents personal preference rather than political statement. You attend Sunday morning services in the basement of Mrs. Kozlova's apartment building where 23 believers gather in whispered prayer around a makeshift altar constructed from a kitchen table covered with her grandmother's embroidered cloth that predates the revolution and serves as one of the few remaining connections to a religious heritage that officially never existed, but somehow persists through underground networks that operate beneath the surface of socialist atheism. The basement itself smells of dampness and decades-old coal storage, creating an atmosphere that transforms religious worship into an act of archaeological faith that connects present believers with spiritual traditions buried but not destroyed by governmental policies designed to eliminate divine competition with state authority. Father Dmitri leads the service using a prayer book whose pages have been hand-copied from memory, after the original disappeared during one of the periodic searches that remind religious communities about the precarious nature of faith in systems where spiritual beliefs represent potential security threats requiring monitoring by authorities who maintain detailed files about citizens whose loyalty to earthly powers might be compromised by allegiance to heavenly ones. His voice carries the careful modulation of someone who's learned to project spiritual authority while avoiding the kind of charismatic leadership that could attract unwanted official attention. The congregation represents a cross-section of Soviet society united by shared willingness to risk administrative consequences for spiritual fulfillment that can't be satisfied through approved recreational activities or political education sessions that substitute ideological fervor for religious experience. Elderly babushkas who remember pre-revolutionary church attendance kneel beside young mothers whose children don't understand why Sunday morning requires secrecy and hushed conversations about activities that seem innocent, but apparently contain elements dangerous enough to necessitate basement locations and constant vigilance. Religious instruction occurs through coded language that presents spiritual concepts using terminology that won't trigger immediate recognition if overheard by neighbors whose religious knowledge might enable them to identify unauthorized theological discussions taking place in residential buildings where such activities violate housing regulations that prohibit unauthorized gatherings for purposes not approved by building management committees. Teaching children about divine love requires metaphorical approaches that sound like discussions about community cooperation rather than religious education that could affect their educational prospects if discovered by school authorities. The communion service uses bread and wine that required the same careful acquisition strategies employed for obtaining Western cigarettes or quality soap, since religious supplies don't exist in stores that serve officially atheist populations whose spiritual needs get addressed through cultural programming designed to replace religious ceremony with socialist celebrations that honor collective achievements rather than divine providence. Such sacramental logistics transform Holy Communion into exercises in underground procurement that would challenge experienced black market operators. Prayer requests reflect the daily challenges of Soviet life filtered through spiritual frameworks that seek divine intervention for problems that governmental systems seem unable or unwilling to address through earthly means. Mrs. Petrov asks for prayers regarding her son's university application, understanding that divine assistance might succeed where political connections have failed. Young Pavel requests spiritual guidance about workplace situations that require ethical choices between personal integrity and professional survival in employment environments where moral compromises become routine survival strategies. The service concludes with careful cleanup procedures that eliminate evidence of religious activity from basement spaces that must appear innocuous to building inspectors or maintenance workers who might report suspicious gatherings to authorities who monitor residential buildings for unauthorized activities that violate housing regulations designed to prevent unsupervised citizen assembly. Such security measures transform religious worship into temporary installations that materialize briefly before disappearing without traces that could implicate participants in activities that officially don't occur. Leaving the basement requires careful timing and dispersed departure. Patterns that avoid creating obvious evidence of group meetings through simultaneous exits that could attract attention from neighbors whose Sunday morning activities might include informal surveillance duties for building management or governmental agencies that encourage citizen monitoring through reward systems that make community oversight more effective than professional surveillance operations. Such precautions make religious fellowship feel like resistance operations against systems that consider spiritual independence a form of political rebellion. Your walk home involves mental preparation for week ahead, where religious inspiration must sustain you through workplace situations, shopping expeditions, and social interactions that require performing secular conformity while maintaining private spiritual beliefs that can't be expressed openly without risking consequences that affect not just personal welfare, but family security within communities where individual religious choices create collective vulnerability. Historians still argue whether Soviet religious persecution represented ideological conviction or practical concern about institutional competition with state authority, but climbing basement stairs after underground worship, such academic debates feel less relevant than the immediate challenge of carrying spiritual peace into daily life within systems designed to eliminate such internal resources through environmental pressures that make faith a form of quiet heroism. You stare at the world map hanging in the community center, its surface marked with red pins indicating Soviet territories and allies, while vast expanses of blue and green represent the forbidden Western world that might as well be fictional kingdoms for all the possibility you have of ever visiting them. The map itself serves as daily reminder of geographical imprisonment within borders that function less like national boundaries and more like the walls of an enormous outdoor prison where 280 million inmates share the illusion of freedom while being prohibited from experiencing life beyond their assigned territory. Your passport sits in a government office filing cabinet, not because you've misplaced it, but because Soviet citizens don't possess documents that would enable independent international travel. Instead, travel permissions get granted through bureaucratic processes that evaluate political reliability, professional necessity, and family connections before determining whether individuals deserve temporary liberation from geographical restrictions that keep populations contained within ideological boundaries designed to prevent contamination from Western ideas that might undermine socialist commitment through exposure to alternative lifestyle options. The Western world exists primarily through fragments that penetrate Iron Curtain barriers despite official efforts to maintain informational isolation. Smuggled photographs showing American supermarkets whose abundance seems like capitalist propaganda until you realize the images might be genuine documentation of consumer economies that function according to principles your society has rejected but apparently never successfully replaced. Such glimpses create cognitive dissonance between official descriptions of Western decline and photographic evidence suggesting prosperity that exceeds Soviet achievements by margins that would challenge fundamental assumptions about systemic superiority. Letters from distant relatives who escaped before borders closed permanently arrive heavily censored, with entire paragraphs blacked out by postal authorities who remove information deemed harmful to socialist morale. Aunt Maria's correspondence from New York contains tantalizing fragments about wonderful opportunities and choices everywhere, though the specific details get eliminated by censorship that leaves only generic pleasantries about weather and health that provide no useful information about life beyond the surveillance state that controls your daily existence through administrative mechanisms designed to prevent citizen exposure to alternatives. Travel dreams require careful private cultivation, since expressing excessive interest in foreign countries could be interpreted as dissatisfaction with Soviet life that necessitates political education sessions designed to correct inappropriate geographical longings through ideological programming that emphasizes the superiority of socialist societies over capitalist alternatives that exploit workers through systems Soviet citizens should feel grateful to avoid. Such educational interventions transform curiosity about the wider world into evidence of insufficient patriotic enthusiasm, requiring corrective attention. The few Soviet citizens who return from authorized international travel, diplomats, trade officials, and carefully selected cultural representatives, develop the haunted expressions of people who've seen alternative realities but can't discuss them openly without risking accusations of bourgeois contamination that could affect their continued employment in positions requiring political reliability. Their carefully neutral descriptions of foreign experiences suggest deeper truths that can't be verbalized in societies where honest comparative analysis could be construed as criticism of existing systems. Western music occasionally penetrates through atmospheric anomalies that enable radio signals to cross borders designed to prevent such cultural infiltration. These brief electronic windows into forbidden entertainment provide tantalizing samples of artistic creativity that seems to flourish in societies where musicians apparently enjoy creative freedom rather than being required to celebrate agricultural achievements through folk songs designed to inspire collective enthusiasm for farming policies. Such accidental cultural exposure creates longings for artistic environments that prioritize aesthetic excellence over political utility. Magazines from Western countries sometimes appear in university libraries or research facilities, though accessing them requires official justification for needing foreign information sources that could expose readers to lifestyle imagery designed to promote capitalist consumption patterns that undermine socialist values through advertising strategies that exploit human desires for material comfort. Viewing such publications feels like archaeological exploration of contemporary civilizations that exist parallel to yours but operate according to entirely different economic and social principles. The most tantalizing travel restriction involves neighboring socialist countries that theoretically share ideological commitments but remain practically inaccessible due to bureaucratic complications that make visiting East Germany more difficult than diplomatic missions to hostile nations. Such administrative barriers suggest that even socialist solidarity has geographic limitations when governments prefer maintaining population control over facilitating international worker solidarity that might enable citizens to make comparative evaluations about different approaches to implementing supposedly shared political philosophies. Your evening entertainment increasingly involves studying atlas pages that detail countries whose names you know but whose realities remain as mysterious as ancient civilizations, creating internal tourism through cartographic exploration that substitutes geographical imagination for actual travel experiences that remain permanently beyond reach unless political circumstances change in ways that seem as unlikely as spontaneous economic improvement or sudden governmental transparency about foreign policy objectives. Historians still argue whether Soviet travel restrictions represented security concerns or acknowledgement that citizen exposure to Western societies might undermine faith in socialist superiority. But sitting here tracing international boundaries with your finger while knowing you'll never cross them, such academic debates feel less relevant than the simple human desire to discover what lies beyond the horizons that define your permanent geographical prison. You discover Sergei's hidden manuscript tucked behind a loose brick in his apartment wall, pages of poetry that would make censorship committees reach for their red pens with the enthusiasm of editors correcting grammatical errors, except these aren't mistakes but deliberate artistic expressions that challenge official aesthetic standards through imagery that suggests individual souls exist independently of collective identity. His poems describe autumn leaves falling like discarded dreams and winter winds carrying whispers of what might have been, language that transforms natural phenomena into metaphors for political disappointment that can't be expressed directly without triggering administrative interest in his psychological reliability. The underground literary scene operates through networks that would impress intelligence agencies if they weren't already monitoring such activities through informants who attend poetry readings disguised as social gatherings where participants discuss weather patterns and seasonal changes while actually sharing verses that critique societal conditions through coded language that requires sophisticated interpretation skills developed by people who've learned to communicate dangerous truths through seemingly innocent metaphors about farming techniques and industrial processes. Anna shares her paintings hidden beneath floorboards, canvases depicting human faces with expressions of profound sadness that contrast sharply with the optimistic socialist realism required for public display. Her artistic technique demonstrates training that exceeds official art school standards, suggesting she's developed skills through private study of Western artistic movements that officially don't exist but somehow influence underground aesthetic development through smuggled art books and carefully shared knowledge about techniques that prioritize emotional authenticity over political messaging. The challenge of artistic creation involves developing dual capabilities, producing approved work that satisfies official requirements while secretly creating genuine art that expresses authentic human experiences through forms that would be condemned as bourgeois individualism if discovered by cultural authorities who evaluate artistic production according to its contribution to collective consciousness rather than personal expression. Such artistic compartmentalization requires creative energy that could otherwise be devoted to developing single artistic visions rather than managing parallel aesthetic identities. Music represents perhaps the most dangerous artistic medium, since songs can't be hidden as easily as paintings or manuscripts, requiring underground composers to create works that sound appropriately socialist when performed publicly, while containing harmonic structures that suggest deeper emotional content to listeners trained in musical subtleties that operate beneath lyrical surface meanings. Victor's compositions celebrate industrial themes through melodies that somehow convey profound melancholy about modern life without using words that could be quoted as evidence of insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm. The underground art economy functions through barter systems where authentic creative works get exchanged for necessities that enable artists to continue producing forbidden art while maintaining official employment that provides survival resources. Sergei's poetry trades for Anna's paintings, which exchange for Victor's musical scores, creating circulation networks that sustain artistic communities through resource sharing that operates independently of monetary systems controlled by authorities who prefer allocating materials toward approved cultural production rather than supporting individual creative expression. Art criticism develops through whispered conversations that analyze techniques, themes, and aesthetic achievements using terminology that avoids political interpretation, while acknowledging that authentic artistic production inherently challenges systems that prioritize collective messaging over individual expression. Such discussions require participants to evaluate artistic merit while avoiding observations that could be construed as criticism of official cultural policies that determine what artistic production receives governmental support and public exhibition opportunities. Storage and preservation of underground art requires security measures that protect both artworks and artists from discovery by authorities who conduct periodic searches for evidence of unauthorized cultural activity that violates regulations prohibiting artistic production that hasn't received official approval through cultural committees that evaluate creative works according to their contribution to socialist educational objectives rather than aesthetic excellence or emotional authenticity. Hidden artworks become cultural time capsules that preserve authentic artistic expression for future generations that might appreciate creative freedom. The psychological impact of maintain. Dual artistic identities creates internal tensions between public conformity and private authenticity that affect artists' mental health in ways that can't be addressed through official medical systems that might interpret artistic frustration as evidence of insufficient social adjustment, requiring political education designed to correct individual attitudes toward collective cultural goals. Such internal conflicts make artistic creation simultaneously essential for psychological survival and dangerous for social security. Sharing underground art requires careful evaluation of potential audiences whose aesthetic appreciation must be balanced against security risks that could compromise entire artistic networks if enthusiastic viewers lack discretion necessary for protecting artistic communities from official attention that could result in criminal charges for cultural activities that violate governmental policies about approved artistic expression. Artistic appreciation becomes a form of conspiracy that transforms cultural consumption into acts of quiet rebellion. Historians still argue whether Soviet cultural policies genuinely aimed to improve artistic quality through collective standards or primarily functioned as control mechanisms that prevented artistic expression from developing themes that might challenge official ideology. But sitting here reading Sergei's hidden poetry while listening for footsteps that might indicate unwanted visitors, such academic debates feel less relevant than the immediate power of authentic art to nourish human spirits that governmental systems seem determined to malnourish through cultural restrictions. You wake at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of engines idling outside your apartment building, followed by careful footsteps in the hallway that suggest official visits rather than residents returning from late shifts at factories that operate around the clock to meet production quotas that exist primarily on paper. Through your thin curtains, you glimpse black cars whose occupants possess the kind of authority that transforms midnight visits into administrative procedures that citizens experience but don't discuss afterward, assuming they remain available for such conversations once the paperwork gets completed. The psychiatric hospital on Kashirskaya Highway serves multiple functions in Soviet society, treating genuine mental illness, housing political dissidents whose sanity gets questioned when their loyalty becomes suspect, and conducting research projects that explore pharmaceutical approaches to correcting inappropriate thoughts through chemical interventions that transform rebellious personalities into compliant citizens who no longer express dangerous opinions about governmental policies or social conditions. Such medical flexibility enables authorities to address political problems through healthcare systems that diagnose dissent as mental illness, requiring therapeutic correction, rather than criminal punishment that might create martyrs. Your neighbor Pavel disappeared 3 months ago after expressing skepticism about agricultural statistics during a workplace meeting where his comments about food shortages were interpreted as evidence of psychological instability that necessitated professional evaluation by medical authorities specializing in cases where political unreliability manifests through symptoms that resemble mental illness but actually represent ideological infection, requiring specialized treatment protocols designed to restore appropriate social attitudes through pharmaceutical intervention combined with intensive counseling sessions. The diagnostic procedures used in political psychiatric cases involve medical terminology that transforms criticism of governmental policies into symptoms of personality disorders that require institutional treatment in facilities where patients receive medications designed to eliminate antisocial thoughts through chemical modifications of brain chemistry that make revolutionary ideas seem less appealing while simultaneously reducing patients' ability to articulate complex political concepts that might influence other citizens toward inappropriate conclusions about systemic effectiveness or leadership competence. Dr. Volkov, who works at the Kashirskaya facility, occasionally visits your building ostensibly for social purposes, but actually to observe residents whose behavior might indicate developing political unreliability that could benefit from early intervention through outpatient counseling programs designed to prevent full-scale psychiatric hospitalization by addressing ideological problems while they remain manageable through less intensive therapeutic approaches. His presence makes conversations more careful as everyone recognizes his professional interest in monitoring community mental health through informal observation of citizen behavior patterns. The treatment protocols combine traditional psychiatric medications with experimental drugs that haven't been tested according to standards that might exist in medical systems more concerned with patient welfare than political utility. Such pharmaceutical research explores chemical approaches to personality modification that could eliminate dissent through biological interventions rather than requiring extensive police monitoring or prison systems that consume resources better allocated toward industrial production goals that advance national development objectives through collective labor rather than individual rehabilitation programs. Families of patients confined to psychiatric facilities receive limited information about treatment progress, visiting schedules, or expected release dates, creating uncertainty that extends institutional control beyond hospital walls into community relationships that become affected by fear of association with individuals whose political reliability has been questioned through medical channels. Such extended influence makes psychiatric hospitalization an effective deterrent that affects not just patients, but entire social networks that might otherwise support citizens whose political opinions deviate from approved standards. The pharmaceutical experimentation includes testing compounds that modify memory formation, alter emotional responses to political stimuli, and reduce intellectual curiosity that might lead patients toward unauthorized conclusions about social conditions or governmental competence. Such research operates according to objectives that prioritize political utility over medical ethics, treating patients as research subjects whose consent isn't required for participation in studies designed to develop more effective approaches to managing populations through medical interventions that eliminate political problems at those. Psychological source. Release from psychiatric facilities requires demonstration of appropriate political attitudes through psychological evaluations that test patients' responses to ideological questions designed to verify that treatment has successfully eliminated dangerous thoughts while restoring proper socialist consciousness. Such assessments measure cure according to political conformity rather than mental health, making recovery depend on patients' ability to express approved opinions convincingly enough to satisfy medical authorities that pharmaceutical interventions have achieved their intended objectives. The community impact of psychiatric political control creates an atmosphere of caution where citizens monitor their own thoughts for ideas that might be interpreted as symptoms of mental illness, requiring medical attention from facilities that specialize in correcting inappropriate political consciousness through treatment programs designed to transform rebellious individuals into cooperative members of socialist society who no longer question policies that previously seemed problematic to their inadequately conditioned minds. Historians still argue whether Soviet psychiatric abuse represented systematic policy or isolated incidents of medical malpractice, but lying awake listening to car engines and footsteps that might indicate your turn for psychological evaluation, such academic debates feel less relevant than the immediate challenge of maintaining mental independence while avoiding thoughts that could be diagnosed as symptoms of political illness requiring therapeutic intervention through chemical approaches to correcting dangerous individuality. You witness the slow starvation of the Ukrainians firsthand when your factory receives volunteer workers from the southern regions, men and women whose hollow eyes and skeletal frames tell stories that official newspapers refuse to print. Their presence serving as living testimony to agricultural policies that transformed fertile farmland into graveyards, while government statistics celebrate record harvests that exist only in bureaucratic fantasies designed to obscure mass death through creative accounting that counts corpses as successful grain exports. The Holodomor unfolds around you through whispered conversations between these displaced workers who speak of villages where children disappeared first, followed by the elderly, then adults who fought over potato peels and tree bark, while government officials requisitioned grain for export to foreign countries whose hard currency mattered more to central planners than the lives of farmers who produced food they weren't allowed to consume. Such testimonies reach your ears through careful nighttime discussions where survivors describe watching their families die while surrounded by fertile soil that could have fed millions if political ideology hadn't transformed agriculture into a weapon against populations deemed insufficiently cooperative with collectivization policies. The mathematical precision of engineered famine becomes apparent through production statistics that reveal grain harvests sufficient to feed the affected regions, yet distribution policies that redirected food toward urban areas where political support seemed more reliable, while rural populations received rations calculated to maintain labor capacity just below survival thresholds. Such calculations demonstrate governmental approaches to population control that use starvation as administrative tool for enforcing compliance with agricultural policies, that prioritize ideological objectives over human welfare through systematic elimination of resistance through controlled malnutrition. Your co-workers from the affected regions describe watching government agents confiscate seed grain needed for future planting, ensuring that even families who survived the immediate famine would face continued food insecurity through agricultural sabotage disguised as requisition policies designed to meet export quotas that generated foreign currency for industrial development projects that benefited urban populations while sacrificing rural communities whose deaths received no official acknowledgement or statistical recognition in mortality records that deliberately undercounted casualties to minimize international criticism. The psychological impact on survivors manifests through behavioral patterns that reveal trauma from witnessing mass death while being powerless to prevent family members from succumbing to starvation that could have been prevented through policy changes that would have prioritized human welfare over export revenues. These workers hoard food with desperate intensity, consuming meals as if each bite might be their last, while displaying hypervigilance about food security that suggests deep understanding of how quickly abundance can transform into deadly scarcity through administrative decisions made by officials who never experience hunger themselves. Food becomes weaponized through policies that link survival to political compliance, creating systems where loyalty gets measured through citizens' willingness to accept official explanations for conditions that contradict observable reality. Families learn to repeat approved narratives about agricultural challenges while privately understanding that government policies deliberately created famines that eliminated populations whose resistance to collectivization threatened centralized control over agricultural production through collective farming methods that consistently produced lower yields than traditional approaches but offered superior surveillance opportunities for monitoring rural populations. The cover-up operations involve medical professionals who receive instructions to attribute famine deaths to diseases that sound more acceptable than starvation, creating mortality statistics that disguise mass killing through bureaucratic language that transforms governmental murder into natural disasters or epidemic illnesses that supposedly affected populations through unfortunate circumstances, rather than deliberate policies designed to eliminate resistance through controlled food distribution systems that rewarded compliance while punishing independence. International awareness gets managed through information control strategies that prevent foreign journalists from documenting conditions in affected regions while simultaneously distributing propaganda that celebrates agricultural successes through carefully staged photography showing abundant harvests in areas unaffected by famine policies. Such media manipulation enables governments to maintain international relationships while conducting domestic genocide through starvation methods that leave fewer traces than conventional military approaches to population elimination, but achieve similar objectives through slow, but equally effective killing processes. The long-term demographic impact reveals itself through population statistics that show mysterious decreases in rural populations that official records attribute to urbanization trends rather than acknowledging mass death through engineered famine that eliminated millions of citizens whose only crime involved resistance to agricultural collectivization policies that transformed independent farmers into state employees working land they previously owned but could no longer control, according to traditional farming wisdom developed through generations of successful agricultural experience. Survivors carry psychological scars that affect their relationships with food, authority, and social systems for decades after the immediate crisis passes, demonstrating how governmental policies that use starvation as control mechanism create trauma that extends far beyond the intended victims to influence entire communities, whose collective memory preserves knowledge about how quickly civilized societies can transform into killing machines that eliminate populations through administrative procedures disguised as economic development policies designed to advance national objectives through human sacrifice on scales that would challenge industrial killing methods for sheer numerical efficiency. Historians still argue whether Soviet famines represented policy failures or deliberate genocide, but working alongside survivors whose bodies bear permanent evidence of systematic starvation, such academic debates feel less relevant than the immediate reality that governments possess capabilities for mass murder through food control that make conventional warfare seem inefficient by comparison, creating killing systems that operate through bureaucratic procedures rather than military actions while achieving elimination objectives that surpass battlefights. LD casualties through administrative approaches to population reduction. You marvel at the technological time warp surrounding your daily existence, where the nation that launched Sputnik and put the first man in space somehow can't manufacture television sets that function reliably or produce automobiles that start consistently in temperatures below freezing. Your workplace radio was manufactured in 1962 and sounds like it's broadcasting from underwater, while Western countries apparently produce portable music players small enough to fit in pockets. Technological achievements that seem like science fiction compared to the electronic equipment available through official Soviet distribution channels that prioritize quantity over quality according to production philosophies that measure success through statistical output rather than consumer satisfaction. The factory where you work produces components for advanced Soviet computers that occupy entire rooms while possessing less processing power than calculators reportedly available in Western markets. Though such comparisons remain theoretical since you've never seen foreign technology except through smuggled photographs that suggest manufacturing capabilities. Your industrial system hasn't achieved, despite decades of 5-year plans designed to surpass capitalist production through socialist efficiency. Your computer operates using vacuum tubes that were obsolete in other countries before you were born, creating technological archaeology where you work with equipment that represents cutting-edge Soviet engineering despite being historical artifacts by international standards. Consumer electronics available in Soviet stores reflect manufacturing priorities that emphasize durability over functionality, producing television sets built like military equipment that survive nuclear attacks but display images with the clarity of abstract impressionist paintings viewed through frosted glass during heavy fog. Your television receives exactly 3 channels when atmospheric conditions cooperate, and the antenna maintains its precarious connection to roof-mounted equipment that requires monthly adjustments performed by residents who've developed engineering expertise through necessity rather than formal technical education. The automobile situation creates cognitive dissonance between national pride in industrial achievements and daily reality of vehicles that require mechanical expertise for basic operation while consuming fuel with the efficiency of steam locomotives pulling freight trains uphill through thick mud. Your neighbour's larder requires 47 minutes of preparation before starting in winter, involving engine preheating, battery warming, and ritualistic procedures that transform simple transportation into mechanical ceremonies honouring the triumph of Soviet automotive engineering over laws of physics and common sense. Telephone technology represents perhaps the most dramatic example of systemic technological lag, where international calls require booking appointments weeks in advance through bureaucratic procedures that make contacting foreign countries more difficult than scheduling meetings with high-ranking government officials. Domestic phone service operates according to principles that suggest Alexander Graham Bell's original designs weren't fully understood by Soviet telecommunications engineers who apparently believed that reliable connections represented bourgeois luxury rather than basic communication infrastructure necessary for modern societies. The space program creates the most puzzling technological contradiction, where the same industrial system that can't produce functional consumer appliances somehow achieves remarkable aerospace engineering that places satellites in orbit and lands cosmonauts on schedule. Such achievements suggest that Soviet technological capabilities exist but get allocated according to political priorities that favor military and space applications over civilian consumer needs that might improve daily life quality for ordinary citizens who benefit from national prestige projects through psychological satisfaction rather than practical technological improvements. Medical equipment reflects similar resource allocation patterns where hospitals receive sophisticated diagnostic machinery that would impress Western physicians while lacking basic supplies like disposable syringes, bandages, or reliable electricity that would enable optimal utilization of advanced equipment. Such contradictions create healthcare environments where cutting-edge technology coexists with primitive conditions that force medical professionals to improvise solutions using equipment combinations that wouldn't be necessary in systems where resource distribution followed logical medical priorities rather than bureaucratic allocation procedures. Manufacturing quality control operates according to standards that prioritize meeting production quotas over creating products that function according to design specifications, resulting in goods that technically fulfill contractual requirements, while failing to perform their intended functions with reliability that consumers in other economic systems apparently take for granted. Your workplace produces items that pass inspection procedures designed to verify compliance with official specifications rather than testing actual performance under normal usage conditions. The recess Research and development system allocates enormous resources toward military applications, while civilian technology development receives minimal funding except for projects that demonstrate socialist superiority through achievements that generate international recognition rather than improving daily life quality for citizens who would prefer functional appliances over prestigious but impractical technological demonstrations. Such priorities create societies where national achievements in advanced fields coexist with primitive conditions in basic consumer technology that affects everyone's daily experience. Information about Western technological standards reaches Soviet citizens through fragments that suggest manufacturing capabilities and consumer options that seem almost fantastical compared to available domestic alternatives, creating technological envy that can't be satisfied through official channels, while simultaneously generating curiosity about industrial systems that apparently achieve consumer satisfaction through competitive market mechanisms rather than centralized planning procedures designed to optimize resource allocation according to political rather than consumer priorities. Historians still argue whether Soviet technological limitations resulted from resource constraints or systemic inefficiencies in centralized planning approaches to industrial development, but sitting here trying to tune a radio that barely functions while knowing that space program achievements demonstrate remarkable engineering capabilities. Such academic debates feel less relevant than the daily frustration of living with technology that represents compromise between what's technically possible and what gets actually produced through systems that prioritize ideology over functionality. You learn not to ask about the Volkovs anymore after Mrs. Petrov's face turns pale and she quickly changes the subject to discussions about weather patterns that have become the neighborhood's default response to questions about families who disappear overnight like morning mist evaporating under governmental heat. The Volkovs occupied apartment 4B until last Tuesday, when black cars arrived at 2:37 a.m. and departed 43 minutes later with passengers who wouldn't be returning to collect their belongings or explain their absence to neighbors who've learned that curiosity about such departures can result in similar midnight transportation arrangements. The apartment remains sealed with official notices warning against unauthorized entry, though everyone understands that its contents have been catalogued by authorities who examine personal possessions for evidence that might implicate additional community members in whatever activities prompted the original residents' removal from society through administrative procedures that operate more efficiently than judicial systems, while producing similar results through bureaucratic mechanisms designed to eliminate problems rather than solve them through legal processes that might require actual evidence of wrongdoing. Neighborhood conversations develop elaborate circumnavigation patterns around topics that might be interpreted as excessive interest in governmental activities that don't concern ordinary citizens who should focus on productive labor rather than speculating about administrative decisions affecting community composition through resident relocation policies. Such linguistic gymnastics transform simple questions about missing neighbors into potential evidence of suspicious curiosity that could attract attention from authorities who monitor community attitudes through informal surveillance networks that operate more effectively than professional intelligence operations. Mrs. Kozlova's 8-year-old grandson asks why the Volkov children aren't attending school anymore, creating uncomfortable silences that demonstrate how disappearances affect not just missing families, but entire communities whose members must learn to forget people who once existed in order to protect themselves from association with individuals whose fate serves as warning about consequences of insufficient political reliability. Children receive explanations that make family relocation sound like career opportunities rather than governmental elimination procedures that transform citizens into non-persons through administrative erasure processes. The psychological impact of systematic disappearances creates community paranoia, where residents evaluate their own behavior for activities that might be interpreted as suspicious, while simultaneously avoiding actions that could be construed as excessive surveillance of neighbors whose monitoring responsibilities remain unclear, but apparently exist according to informal social contracts that make everyone responsible for observing everyone else's adherence to unstated behavioral standards that change without notification according to political circumstances beyond community control. You sense the system's structural decay through countless daily indicators that suggest the ideological foundation supporting Soviet society has developed cracks that no amount of propaganda can successfully conceal from populations who experience reality through grocery stores that remain empty despite official announcements about agricultural abundance, factory equipment that breaks down faster than replacement parts can be manufactured, and government officials whose private behaviour contradicts their public speeches about socialist virtue with such obvious hypocrisy that even committed party members begin questioning whether leadership believes its own rhetoric. The economic contradictions become impossible to ignore when your factory supervisor, Comrade Petrov, arrives at work in Western clothing clearly obtained through channels that don't exist according to official economic policies, while simultaneously delivering speeches about the superiority of Soviet manufacturing that produced the poorly fitting uniform he requires workers to wear during ideological education sessions. Such visible disparities between leadership lifestyle and worker conditions create cognitive dissonance that undermines official messaging about classless society achievements through socialist equality that apparently doesn't extend to consumer goods distribution systems. Young people increasingly express skepticism about political promises through coded conversations that suggest growing awareness of systemic failures masked by statistical manipulations designed to create impressions of progress where none exists. University students who should represent the future of socialist society instead demonstrate disturbing tendencies toward questioning official narratives about economic achievements, international relations, and social development that previous generations accepted without the kind of analytical scrutiny that threatens ideological consensus necessary for maintaining political stability through collective belief in governmental competence. Party meetings begin exhibiting reduced attendance as members develop sudden illnesses, family emergencies, and work obligations that coincidentally coincide with scheduled ideological education sessions where enthusiasm for collective goals seems increasingly difficult to maintain among audiences who witness daily evidence of systematic dysfunction that contradicts official descriptions of socialist success. Such participation decline suggests erosion of political commitment among citizens whose loyalty depended on belief in governmental effectiveness rather than fear of administrative consequences for insufficient revolutionary fervour. The black market economy expands beyond luxury goods into basic necessities as official distribution systems fail to provide items essential for normal life, forcing even loyal socialist citizens to participate in capitalist trading relationships that violate ideological principles but enable survival in conditions where governmental supply systems can't fulfill their theoretical responsibilities for ensuring citizen welfare through centralized resource allocation. Such economic evolution demonstrates practical limitations of socialist theory when implemented through bureaucratic mechanisms that prioritize political control over functional distribution systems. International awareness penetrates through increasing numbers of foreign radio broadcasts that Soviet jamming equipment apparently can't block effectively, exposing citizens to comparative information about living standards, political systems, and economic conditions that suggest alternative approaches to organizing society produce better results than centralized planning methods that seemed more successful when populations lacked access to information about conditions extends beyond national borders. Such exposure creates uncomfortable comparisons that undermine confidence in systemic superiority claims that form the foundation of political legitimacy. Military effectiveness shows signs of decline through rumors about equipment failures, supply shortages, and morale problems that suggest even armed forces designed to protect socialist achievements suffer from resource allocation problems and motivational issues that affect combat readiness in ways that could compromise national security if international conflicts required military responses supported by industrial systems that apparently can't produce reliable consumer goods or maintain basic infrastructure necessary for supporting modern warfare capabilities. Regional variations in living standards become more apparent as communication improvements enable citizens to compare conditions across different areas of the Soviet Union, revealing disparities that contradict official policies about equal development and resource distribution designed to eliminate geographic inequality through centralized planning that apparently allocates resources according to political priorities rather than population needs or regional development requirements that might improve overall living conditions through targeted investments. Cultural production shows increasing signs of creative exhaustion as artists, writers, and musicians struggle to find inspiration within ideological frameworks that restrict creative expression to themes and styles that serve political objectives rather than artistic vision, resulting in entertainment that satisfies neither audiences seeking genuine cultural experiences nor officials seeking effective propaganda tools for maintaining population enthusiasm about socialist achievements that become less credible as artistic quality continues declining through bureaucratic management of creative industries. The psychological impact on ordinary citizens manifests through increasing cynicism about official promises, reduced participation in voluntary activities, and growing interest in private rather than collective pursuits that suggest fundamental shifts in social attitudes away from communist ideology toward individualistic behaviors that prioritize personal welfare over community goals. Such attitudinal changes indicate erosion of the social consensus necessary for maintaining political systems that depend on citizen cooperation rather than coercive force for implementing governmental policies. Even committed party officials begin expressing private doubts about long-term systemic viability through conversations that wouldn't have occurred during earlier periods when ideological certainty provided psychological foundation for careers dedicated to advancing socialist objectives through governmental service. Such internal questioning among leadership suggests institutional recognition of problems that can't be solved through traditional approaches involving increased centralization, stricter political control, or enhanced propaganda efforts designed to maintain public support for policies that produce consistently disappointing results. Historians still argue whether Soviet decline resulted from inherent systemic flaws or external pressures that overwhelmed otherwise functional political and economic structures, but living through daily evidence of institutional failure while watching officials pretend nothing has changed, such academic debates feel less relevant than the immediate challenge of adapting to social transformation that seems irreversible despite governmental efforts to maintain appearances of stability and progress through increasingly desperate propaganda campaigns that convince fewer people with each passing day. You wake on December 26, 1991 to discover that the Soviet Union no longer exists. A political entity that dominated your entire life has simply evaporated overnight like morning frost, leaving behind confusion, uncertainty, and the strange taste of freedom that arrives without instruction manuals or guarantees about whether liberation represents improvement or simply different forms of struggle. The red flag with its hammer and sickle has been replaced by the Russian tricolor. though such symbolic changes feel less significant than the practical questions about whether your job will exist tomorrow, your apartment will remain affordable, and your pension will retain any value in economic systems that apparently operate according to principles nobody fully understands yet. The initial euphoria of freedom mixes with practical anxieties about surviving in societies where governmental guarantees about employment, housing, and healthcare have disappeared, along with the political system that provided such security through mechanisms that citizens criticized but depended upon for basic survival. Your factory supervisor announces that production will continue under new management, though nobody can explain what new management means or how worker rights will be protected in economic systems based on competition rather than collective ownership of industrial facilities that previously belonged to everyone and therefore nobody in particular. Shopping becomes simultaneously easier and more difficult as store shelves fill with previously unavailable goods whose prices reflect market mechanisms that make many items accessible only to citizens who've developed entrepreneurial skills or maintained savings accounts that retained value through economic transformation. The bread lines disappear, replaced by bread availability that requires monetary resources many people lack as employment. Insecurity vanishes along with the governmental systems that guaranteed work for everyone willing to participate in collective labor designed to advance national objectives through industrial production quotas. The psychological adjustment to individual responsibility proves challenging for populations trained to expect governmental solutions for personal problems through administrative procedures that addressed citizen needs according to bureaucratic protocols rather than market transactions requiring personal initiative and financial resources. Freedom includes the liberty to fail, starve, and become homeless through personal decisions or economic circumstances beyond individual control, possibilities that didn't exist in systems where governmental incompetence at least provided consistent incompetence rather than unpredictable market forces that reward some citizens while eliminating others through competitive processes. International travel becomes theoretically possible but practically difficult as passport acquisition requires navigating new bureaucratic systems while possessing financial resources sufficient for foreign trips that represent enormous expenses for citizens whose salaries were calculated according to socialist economic principles that didn't anticipate conversion to market currencies. The world beyond Soviet borders remains largely inaccessible, despite political changes that eliminated travel restrictions but created financial barriers that affect access more effectively than previous administrative prohibitions against unauthorized international movement. Consumer choice overwhelms decision-making capabilities developed through decades of shopping in systems where availability determined selection rather than preference among multiple options, requiring comparative evaluation of features, prices, and quality differences that were previously irrelevant in economies where obtaining any product represented success rather than choosing optimal products from competing alternatives. Such abundance creates decision paralysis among consumers who lack experience with market-based selection criteria necessary for navigating retail environments designed to serve customer preferences rather than distributing available inventory according to administrative allocation procedures. Religious freedom arrives simultaneously with economic uncertainty, creating opportunities for spiritual expression that many citizens embrace while struggling with practical survival challenges that make theological concerns seem less urgent than immediate needs for food, shelter, and employment that provide basic security previously guaranteed through governmental systems that may have functioned poorly but at least functioned predictably according to established bureaucratic procedures that citizens understood even when they criticized such mechanisms for inefficiency and corruption. The emergence of crime represents an unexpected consequence of freedom. as law enforcement systems designed to maintain political control prove inadequate for addressing criminal behavior motivated by economic opportunities created through market systems that reward entrepreneurial initiative, including illegal entrepreneurship, that flourishes in regulatory environments where traditional social controls have disappeared but effective legal frameworks haven't yet developed sufficient strength to maintain public safety through conventional police procedures. Educational Institute. ONS struggle to adapt curricula that emphasize political indoctrination toward programs that prepare students for economic competition, requiring skills that weren't necessary in systems where employment assignments depended more on political reliability than professional competence. Teachers who spent careers delivering ideological education must learn market-relevant subjects while maintaining authority over students who recognize that previous educational content has become historically irrelevant rather than practically useful for succeeding in transformed social environments. Cultural production explodes with creative energy as artistic restrictions disappear, though artists discover that creative freedom includes financial responsibility for supporting artistic careers through market mechanisms rather than governmental funding that previously sustained cultural activities regardless of popular appeal or commercial viability. Such economic pressures create different constraints on artistic expression that prioritize audience satisfaction over political messaging, but may limit experimental work that doesn't attract sufficient consumer support for financial sustainability. Nostalgia for Soviet security begins developing among citizens who discover that freedom includes responsibility for consequences that governmental systems previously managed through administrative procedures, creating psychological conflicts between appreciation for personal liberty and longing for social safety nets that protected individuals from economic risks through collective insurance programs that distributed individual misfortune across entire populations rather than requiring personal preparation for unemployment, illness, or economic disasters. The taste of freedom proves complex, simultaneously sweet and bitter, liberating and terrifying, promising and uncertain. You possess choices your parents never imagined while facing challenges they never encountered, creating opportunities for personal development alongside risks for personal destruction that make every decision carry weight that wasn't necessary when governmental systems made most life choices through administrative procedures that eliminated individual responsibility along with individual freedom. As night settles over this transformed landscape where familiar landmarks remain while everything else changes according to principles you're still learning to understand, you realize that liberation represents not the end of struggle, but simply different struggles that require new skills, different strategies, and psychological adjustments that will take years to complete. The Soviet citizen you were yesterday has become someone new today, though exactly who that person might become remains as uncertain as the future of this strange new world where anything seems possible, including complete failure of everything you've known throughout your lifetime. Sleep comes slowly to minds processing transformation that feels simultaneously like awakening from long dreams and entering unfamiliar nightmares where the rules keep changing without notification. Tomorrow will bring additional challenges that today's freedom has created, along with opportunities that yesterday's restrictions prevented, in endless cycles of adaptation that define liberation, not as arrival at final destinations, but as continuous journeys toward possibilities that remain perpetually uncertain, but genuinely available for the first time in your adult memory. The sounds of this transformed world gradually fade as night deepens around memories that span the collapse of empires and the birth of uncertain freedoms. Your breathing slows to match the rhythm of history itself, sometimes rapid with change, sometimes steady with endurance, always continuing toward tomorrows that arrive without guarantees but filled with possibilities that previous generations could only imagine in dreams they dared not speak aloud. The apartment grows quiet, except for ordinary sounds of life continuing, despite political upheavals that redraw maps and rewrite constitutions but cannot eliminate the fundamental human needs for rest, peace, and hope that survive every transformation civilization has ever witnessed. Outside your window, the same stars shine over landscapes where new nations are learning to become themselves while carrying forward the wisdom and scars earned through experiences that tested human resilience in ways that revealed both the worst and best possibilities contained within ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times. Let your eyes close now on this long journey through the life you never lived, but somehow understand through the shared humanity that connects all souls who have struggled with systems larger than themselves, found love despite surveillance, created beauty within restrictions, and discovered that freedom, when it finally arrives, tastes like morning air after the longest night, fresh with promise yet somehow familiar, as if you had been holding your breath for decades without realizing it, waiting for permission to exhale completely and begin breathing according to rhythms determined by your own heart rather than imposed by forces beyond your control. Sleep now, knowing that stories like these remind us how precious and fragile are the freedoms we too easily take for granted, and how resilient is the human spirit that finds ways to flourish even in the harshest conditions, creating love, art, friendship, and hope in places where such things were officially impossible but proved to be ultimately indestructible. Like stars that continue shining even when clouds make them temporarily invisible to eyes that have forgotten how to look upward in search of light that has never actually disappeared, only been obscured by circumstances that seemed permanent but were, like all human political arrangements, merely temporary interruptions in the longer story of ordinary people living extraordinary lives with quiet courage that deserves remembering in moments of peace like this one, where rest comes easily and dreams arrive gently, carrying you safely through the night toward morning possibilities that belong entirely to you.